I feel like I want to tweet if I have something to say.
I rarely tweet.
Me arguing about mushrooms on Twitter today.
Yeah, I did see that. You were really fired up about the whole fungi plant thing.
It's such a easy thing to get right.
But they grow, Ryan.
Oh, so do we.
From ScienceSortOf.com, you're listening to Science Sort of.
Hello and welcome to Science Sort of. You're listening to episode 310. Our theme this week is ecosystem disservice. I am your host, Ryan Haupt, and joining me to talk about things that are science, things that are sort of science, and things that wish they were science, it's Joe Batwinis.
Hello, everyone.
Mi amigo, according to Joe himself.
See.
Joe confirmed that we are friends. Finally. Took all this time. We did it.
Somos amigos.
I'll take it. So Joe.
Yes.
Let me tell you what happened.
Okay, what happened?
I was on Twitter. Never
trouble.
a good start to a story.
Yeah, that nothing good comes from saying, so I was on Twitter last night.
And I saw a tweet thread that was retweeted by a friend of mine from back in Wyoming. And I started reading up on it because it was all about a new paper that had come out that was about the idea of rewilding, specifically reintroducing carnivores to ecosystems, which you know I'm about.
This is like your favorite subject.
It's a subject that is a favorite of mine.
When it comes up, you get very excited.
I will also get impassioned to take away your ability to translate the Spanish word I just taught you. So Jesse is a PhD student at the University of Wyoming who does animal ecology and conservation biology. And he had sent out this Twitter thread sort of about a paper that he and his team, his lab group had just published about how carnivore rewilding is a hot topic, and we claim to understand how it works based on examples like Yellowstone, but actually we don't really have enough data to say that, and it's possible that it doesn't go that way. And so I was like, well, I'm going to be in Wyoming. I was in Wyoming for some work, and I thought, Wyoming's a small town. The campus is even smaller. I'm just gonna slide into Jesse's DMs and see if he wants to talk to me, and he did.
I feel like you may have just slighted the entire state of Wyoming by calling Wyoming a small town.
In terms of population.
I mean, I suppose.
It is. It's a small town in that I was in Wyoming for like 2 weeks and I didn't have a car. I was in Laramie and I didn't have a car, and it was still like actively snowing most days. It was snowing when we did this interview it was a couple of weeks ago at this point, and I still was able to walk everywhere because it's small. So, and there's no public transit to speak of other than like the university shuttle system, which I've never ridden before in my entire time there. So I hit up Jesse and was like, hey, if you're in town, I'm in town. I do this podcast. I noticed looking at Jesse's website that he also does a podcast, and we'll talk about that in the interview. But I was like, would you want to, meet up at Coal Creek Tap Room, which is one of the better beer bars in town, and talk about your stuff? And he said yes. And so we set up a time, and this is that conversation.
Nice.
So for the first part of the interview, it's more of an introduction to Jesse and kind of how he got into science and where that has led him and the kind of stuff that he was studying and continues to study up to where this kind of genesis of the paper came from. And that's the first part of my interview, and that's coming up right now.
Come on, vamonos. Everybody, let's go.
So I'm being joined by Jesse Alston, who is in the Department of Zoology and Physiology at the University of Wyoming, and we're here in Laramie, and we're excited to talk to you about the work you do. So thanks for joining us, Jesse.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
What we normally like to do, and I explained this to you when we were going back and forth online, is we like to kind of give people a chance to talk about what their science is generally before getting into like the specific new cool thing you just published. So can you tell us what kind of scientist you identify as, or you tell people you are when you like sit next to them on a plane or something?
Yeah, so it's a little bit complicated with me. I don't really come from a specific like taxonomic background or really theme background, but most of the stuff I do now is kind of trying to scale up things that are happening with climate change and how climate and weather impact animals on an individual level, and then trying to scale that up to populations, communities, even at like continental scale stuff. There's a lot of cool research showing that like El Nino has like these broad general patterns across animals overall, and so that's the main focus of my research.
So do you think of yourself as like a macroecologist?
In some ways. I come from a wildlife background, and so like a lot of the questions there are like very taxon or system specific. And so I'm kind of trying to come from that background and then look at some of these macroecology questions, hopefully from kind of a little bit different perspective than most people who come from a much broader background.
Cool. So when you say you come from a wildlife background, what does that mean exactly? Like, where did you go to undergrad? What did you study that led you up to being here in Laramie?
Well, I guess even before I came from a wildlife background, so I grew up in North Carolina. I went to Davidson College, which is a small liberal arts college in North Carolina. And when I was in undergrad, I came from a pretty poor, pretty rural area, didn't really know what I wanted to do. And then so knew I really liked environmental stuff, so I majored in environmental studies with a focus on policy type stuff. So minored in economics, did a lot of stuff at kind of the interface between environmental science and economics. Did a capstone project on trying to build a bioeconomic model of a fishery back east. And then my senior year, still wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. Knew I didn't want to go to an office just yet, which is where all the good paying jobs were. So decided to apply for a whole bunch of field jobs and got lucky enough to get one of those.
You say field jobs, you mean like at a national park or something? Or
yeah, so I worked the first summer out. I worked for the U.S. Forest Service out in Washington doing spotted owl surveys. Then moved from there to Minnesota. Spent a while there in Duluth doing all kinds of stuff for the University of Minnesota Duluth. And then did a couple more things before I wound up back at Wyoming.
Cool. Yeah, so it's kind of I think we have similar trajectories. We come from in the South or Appalachia, go to the West Coast, spend some time in Central Time Zone, and then end up in the mountains. I had a very similar path through that. So you study lots of different kinds of animals. So you said you're kind of a taxon generalist. So what are some of the types of animals or mammals, I guess, specifically that you like to focus on or have been focused on recently?
Yeah, so my dissertation is on bats. I came here to do a bat project for the National Park Service. Since then, I've kind of expanded that out. Still all questions on bats, but using a big continental scale data set that I've been able to collect. Some other stuff that I have worked with or am working on. I'm working on a paper with moose. I'm still kind of on the climate change stuff, looking at how individual moose change their movements as a result of when it gets hot, because they're super heat intolerant, and so they're
So you're saying they run really hot, so they can't handle the heat? Is that,
yeah,
okay.
so they can't handle the heat. So if it gets above 14 to 17 degrees Celsius, which is well below room temperature, then they start panting and doing other things to try to...
I'm distracted because this person's parallel parking very badly outside and almost just hit that other car. So are you working with the moose here in Wyoming, or are you working with moose in other areas?
No, I'm using a data set that I got access to when I was in Minnesota. So all these are Minnesotan moose, yeah.
Cool. Where they also have wolves, right?
Yeah.
Are there wolves are back in Minnesota? And so what got you interested in bats in the first place?
It was really just... the opportunity to come to Wyoming and come to a lab whose work I really respected. So I reached out to a whole bunch of different people for grad school. Some were interested, some weren't, some had funding, some didn't. And visited a few schools, and this was the school that seemed like the best fit. So I come from a rural area. Wyoming's pretty rural.
Yeah.
Had a really good opportunity, a well-funded project with the Park Service. I knew I kind of wanted to work with an agency, doing some kind of applied stuff for my graduate degree, and had a lot of flexibility to kind of do what I wanted to. So the questions that the Park Service wanted answered were pretty simple. And so while I'm answering those simpler questions, I have enough resources to kind of get at more interesting questions, I think.
And so when you say you have data sets from various national parks, that's data that the parks themselves are collecting or were collecting already that you then get access to and can use that data to answer questions, or how exactly does the partnership work?
My work with the Park Service is just at Jewel Cave National Monument.
Where's that?
In the Black Hills in South Dakota.
Okay.
So with the Park Service, I'm really just kind of working with them to answer some applied questions for how they can better manage their bats.
And I mean, South Dakota's still pretty far from where White Nose has reached, right?
Well, it was when I started.
Is it pretty close now? Or?
Now, some collaborators of mine found it at the park unit where I'm working at last year.
Oh, that sucks.
So, yeah.
What kind of bats are there multiple species of bats? Or I guess I don't know a lot about cave ecosystems when it comes to bats? Are they typically dominated by one species of bat, or do you get communities of bats all sharing the same space? Or?
So it depends. So most bats actually pretty rarely use caves. So a lot of bats hibernate in caves during the winter. Some bats migrate and actually don't spend any time in caves. And then during the summer, there's some that
and you have those super cute banana leaf bats that live in the tropics.
Yeah. So kind of across the U.S., there are places that have, by U.S. standards at least, have super diverse communities. And then generally, the further north you go and the further east you go, it gets a little bit less diverse. And so Jewel Cave is really interesting because we're kind of at the place where a lot of eastern species meet western species.
Oh, cool.
So, and that's true of like birds. We get like eastern bluebirds and mountain bluebirds in the same place. Some eastern woodpeckers and western woodpeckers in the same place. It's true of bats. It's true of mammals too. So there's both white-tailed and mule deer there. You see them all the time in about equal proportions.
And what's interesting is that, like, I think because they fly and because of some other characteristics of them being kind of weird mammals, like a lot of times when you're reading studies that try to encompass a lot of mammalian diversity, they'll often say, like, we included all terrestrial non-volunt mammals, which means basically we left out all marine mammals and all bats. Yeah. And, like, bats are hugely diverse and live all over the world.
Yeah, so bats, I think, are about a quarter of all mammal species.
Yeah, rodents are the most species diverse group of mammals, and then I think bats are second.
Yeah, bats are second. And most of that diversity is in the tropics, and it's clustered in a group that we don't really have in the U.S. So I think the Philostomid are the most diverse, I guess, family.
The two main groups are the mega and the micro chiropterans,
so that's what we used to think.
Oh,
and
okay.
Now,
now
there's been some kind of pushback on that. And I'm not super into the systematics part of bat research, but it seems like it doesn't neatly follow along those lines like we used to think it did.
As a paleontologist, they're pretty tough on the fossil record too, because they're very fragile.
Yeah.
And so they don't tend to preserve super well.
Yeah, although I've heard of some pretty interesting research where people are using paleontological methods to do more modern research, because like there'll be at a big hibernacular, there's tons of bats using these caves for the past few centuries. Mm-hmm. A few of them die every winter, and so if you go in there and like survey pretty systematically, you can get skulls, and then you can like basically treat those as fossils and do some morphological stuff and things like that.
I like bats because a lot of the main mammal that I study are sloths, and so like it's the only other mammal that's figured out how to hang upside down for most of its life, which is kind of a weird shared characteristic that, you know, you think of like these really hyper bats and these really slow sloths. And then there's also this other weird connection that in the fossil record, vampire bats are actually a pretty good indicator of like temperature, because they're very temperature sensitive taxon. And so there's theories about why we find sloth bones in caves, and if you can find a vampire bat in that cave too, it says something about like what the temperature was like and whether the cave was being used as a thermal refuge for these two completely different animals.
Yeah, that's super neat.
Yeah. Okay, so do you actually get to go to the cave? Do you get to do field work?
So the Jewel Cave National Monument itself is like 3 or 4 square miles. It's a pretty small park unit, but it's completely surrounded by national forest. And so I don't do that much at the cave. We have a pit tag reader.
What does that mean?
The cave entrance. So pit tags are like basically pet microchips, and so they're pretty common to use in like fish research, because you can put pit tag readers at various places in streams and inject these little microchips in fish.
So like literally the same thing you'd put in your dog?
Yeah.
Wow.
Pretty much. And so when fish pass these pit tag reader arrays that are configured various ways and have different strengths and things like that, but often when fish pass these readers, then you can like get date time stamp of when they passed it. And
that's
so
amazing.
Like if you have a stationary fish, then you can like get a whole bunch of timestamps in kind of the same place. Or if you have a migratory fish, you can like time like salmon migration.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, pretty like exactly. And so that's part of our research there, is trying to figure out how the bats are using the cave when they're entering it, when they're exiting it, so that they can plan cave tours and things like that to mitigate their impacts on bats a little bit more, and see which species exactly are using the caves at which specific times. But is this
cave developed? Is it like Mammoth Cave with walkways and lights and stuff, or is it mostly left unfinished?
Yeah, so the area where I'm working is, they call it the historic entrance, which is kind of a natural entrance that they made bigger so they could develop it a little bit, kind of back in the day. Now they have this fancy elevator system where you go deeper into the cave. And so I think you start the cave tour in some nice rooms that are like a mile or two into the cave.
Are you a cave guy? Have you ever gone caving? I've never gone.
I'm not a cave guy.
I've been tempted by it recently.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting world. I didn't really know that there was like little like kind of, it's like a cult kind of thing. And so like there's lots of people who are like really avid cavers in the same way that people are like really avid climbers or mountain bikers or things like that. And I wasn't really aware of that until I started doing bat research. And then there's a lot of overlap in between cave people and bat people for kind of obvious reasons.
Yeah. And then you got Batman. Sorry, I'm a big comic book nerd, in addition to many other nerdy pursuits. I went up to do a little bit of field work in Natural Trap Cave up just kind of west of the Beartooth Mountains. And I brought my climbing gear because I thought, because it's a cave you have to actually get lowered into on a rope line with descenders and ascenders and then ascend back out that rope line. And so I thought, like, well, I've got climbing gear. That should be, or I have rock climbing gear and I have tree climbing gear. And I got there and they were just like, none of that gear works for what we do in these caves. And I felt real dumb, but at least my helmet worked. I had a helmet. Yeah. So, but I was very surprised by the lack of overlap in kind of the gear and the techniques and the things I was used to doing above the ground.
Yeah, I think in some ways it's kind of like the difference between rock climbing and ice climbing from what I've heard. Like there's kind of same techniques, but when you're doing gear and things like that, then it's pretty different.
I never did any ice climbing when I lived out here, which I kind of regret. Seems like it'd be pretty fun, but
yeah, I mean, it seems more super dangerous than super fun to me.
So you're getting this data from the Park Service. You're helping them develop management strategies. I assume that means managing the bat population so that it's stable and sustainable. And
yeah, and so like from the Park Service perspective, they want there to be as many bats as possible.
Okay.
And so the cave part of it is one part of my research, but what became the bigger part of my research, so bats are hibernating in the cave in winter, and that's one thing that they're really interested in, but one thing that I'm really interested in is what they're doing during the summer.
Okay.
And so during the summer, they're just kind of like out on the landscape. The species that I study roost mostly in tree cavities and rock crevices.
What's the species?
So I'm working with one species. It's the northern long-eared bat. It's federally threatened because of white nose syndrome. And then the other species I'm mainly working with is the fringe myotis, which is pretty closely related, but it's a western species, whereas the northern long-eared is an eastern species.
Okay.
It hasn't really come into contact with white nose yet. We think it'll probably be pretty susceptible, but it's one of those species that is pretty widespread across the West, but it doesn't seem to be very common in many places. And so my site actually seems to be kind of unusual because it is pretty common at my site.
Cool. So speaking of being a kind of superhero nerd, I was not a fan of the Batman vs. Superman movie, but I have a hard time hating on it entirely because I found out that all the sets that they built, they broke down the wood for those sets and used them to build bat boxes and bat houses for to help prevent the white nose syndrome. And I was like, okay, that's actually kind of nice. Like, I didn't like the movie, but good on you for helping out the bats.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting.
I think we talked about this on the show before, but I'll go ahead and ask you, is the idea of people putting like a bat box on their property, is that actually helpful to helping bats survive white nose or have places to roost away from places where they might get infected?
I think it definitely can be, but it's kind of like bird feeders where certain species are helped more than others. So when you put bird seed out in the winter, you're helping the species that are there in the winter, and you're helping the species that eat seeds because you're not putting out a bunch of mealworms or things like that. With bat boxes, not every species will use them, but the species that do use them, it seems to be a good thing. I don't really see any downsides to it.
So how'd you go from these like super high metabolism flying around to moose, one of the largest land mammals, the largest land mammal in North America and one of the largest mammals on Earth, mammals on Earth?
Well, so I didn't really go from one to the other. So when I went to Duluth, when I was working there, I just worked on a series of a whole bunch of different projects. And so some of that work just happened to be on moose, and some of it just happened to be on bats.
Do you have a preference?
Not really.
So you really are kind of animal, you're a generalist. You really
I mean, animals are cool regardless of what they are. So
are there consistencies in the methods or techniques that you use when you're looking at different groups of mammals? Like, are there similar methods you apply across the spectrum?
In some ways. So like a lot of the research that is done on ungulates, so things like moose and deer right now, we're using GPS collars to get locations on them. But the technology just before that was VHF telemetry, where you were like physically tracking these things to a location and like manually sighting them and then marking a location on a map. It's way more labor intensive and the technology is not quite as fancy, but that's actually exactly what we're doing with the bats at Jewel Cave. So we're putting these tiny little VHF transmitters on them, and so
VHF stands for very high frequency.
Yeah.
So that means it's like got a good range, I guess, or short range.
I think that refers to like the wavelength of the signal, but I'm not exactly sure. I'm not like super in tune with the physics of radio.
But it makes it so that you can zero in on where exactly they are using the radio
so
frequency.
it's like we have these little readers that we stick antennas on, and you can, I think the benefit of that seems to be that it's like you can use these readers like a radio tuner, and so like if you want to pick up a radio station, you tune it to like 106.9 or whatever. Mm-hmm. We can do the same thing and tune it to a frequency, and then these transmitters just send out little beeps. And so depending on what the beep sounds like, if it's like nice and loud and clear, then we can get an idea of how close it is and things like that. Whereas if it's like really fuzzy or just kind of barely there, there's mostly static, then we're a little bit further away.
It almost sounds like radio frequency dowsing rods. Like it sounds like you're one of those guys out there with the dowsing rod looking for water, except you have an actual like signal that you're following to try to find.
And sometimes it feels a lot like that.
Now I'm going to ask, I have a very personal question because I lived here in Wyoming for a number of years and I had some run-ins with the meese living up in the hills. How close do you have to get to actually spot them? Like how far back can you keep your distance? Because they can be pretty mean.
Well, from the moose, I think a lot of times you would do triangulation, so you would get an idea that it was like pretty close and get a directional signal, and then you move, say, a half a kilometer kind of parallel to where you think, or perpendicular from where you think it is, and then get a directional signal from there, and then basically just like draw an X on the map. And you can get like more than 2 or 3 signals if you want to try to get that a little bit more precise. But that's how for some of these larger animals, that's what a lot of people tend to do, just because one, you don't want to get too close to them for personal safety reasons.
Oh, yeah.
And two, you don't want to disturb them too much.
Yeah.
So if you're just like constantly chasing them around the woods, we don't think that that's going to reflect like natural moose behavior.
Yeah, that's an interesting aspect of like field ecology where you want to get as much data from the animal as you can, but you also don't want to bother it as much as possible. I deal with that with living sloths too, because if you pull one out of the tree to take a sample, you don't want to accidentally pull that same individual out of the tree again because you don't need the sample again, but you also are stressing the animal out a lot. So it's a fine line to walk. And the crazy thing about moose is that like they're so quiet. You can be scary close to a moose, and like I mean scary literally, like scary close to a moose without realizing it just because of how quietly they can move through the woods for how big they are.
Yeah, I mean, I think after a while you get kind of a sense for it. This looks like a moosey area. It's a lot easier out west because like we have these very clear delineations between like what wetlands look like and what like conifer forests look like on the mountainsides. And so you can go to a willow kind of swamp and say, I bet there's a moose here. But when you're in Minnesota, like the whole northeastern part of the state is a swamp, and so a moose might be pretty much anywhere out
Gotcha.
there.
I didn't even think about that. Yeah, and I read after one of my Harrier moose encounters up in Happy Jack, where I was actually charged by a moose because we were hiking with dogs, and the moose got flushed by the dogs and ended up between us and the dogs, and that's because normally I would just back away slowly and not run or whatever, but with the dogs on the other side of the moose, we had to figure out what to do, and the moose ended up charging, and it was very scary. And then I looked it up later, and it was a female. It was here in Wyoming, and it turns out that is the smallest moose possible. Like if you were dealing with an adult moose, the subspecies that lives in Wyoming and the female of that subspecies are as small as moose get, and that's the one that nearly took me out, and it was plenty big. It was huge.
Yeah, although the females are usually the ones, they're like bears, where females are the ones that usually pose the most danger.
Oh, really?
Particularly when they have calves, and so they're super defensive of their calves. It takes a lot of effort and energy from a female to produce a calf, and so it wants to make sure that it stays alive, at least in its first year. And so a lot of the like aggressive encounters people have are like with bears or females trying to protect a calf.
I mean, we didn't see any calves, but it's possible there was one nearby. I think it was just because it got flushed by the dogs and was already freaked out. It was chasing the dogs, really, but then the dogs ran at us, and as the people they were trying to hide behind. And so when the dog hides behind you, then the moose is coming at you now. So
yeah, the dogs know they don't have to be that much faster than the moose. They just have to be faster than you.
And they were, and it was, I've had a few moments in my life where I've felt the adrenaline pumping for like a half hour afterwards, where you're physically shaking because of how much like juice you got in that moment. But I hope that never happens to me again, is what I will say. So big picture, you collect various kinds of data to assess management strategies for various kinds of animals and how that applies to the ecosystem or the landscape writ large. Is that sort of a broad summary of the kind of work you do?
Yeah. And I started off with these really applied questions. So like, how are the bats using the cave? When are they using them? What species are using the cave? What kind of trees that these bats are going to? Can we like figure out what kind of trees that they're using so that when we're logging or when we're doing prescribed burns or things like that, we're not getting rid of those trees, we're getting rid of other trees that maybe aren't as good. And then kind of one thing that really turned me to what I do now is the technology has gotten a little bit better for these VHF transmitters. And so the transmitters that I have can tell you the skin temperature of the bat based on the number of pulses that...
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. And so we know when these bats are going into torpor.
It's just like hibernation?
Yeah, it's like a little mini hibernation. Okay. So like pretty much every day, these bats, when they're just sitting there during the day, they're not like doing anything. They're just sitting in a cavity somewhere. And we think that they use torpor pretty consistently just to save energy.
And the white nose fungus is something that interrupts their torpor cycle, we think?
So yeah, white nose interrupts hibernation during the winter. And so there's a lot of overlap between summer torpor and winter hibernation on the kind of physiological aspects of it. But I was really interested in the summer torpor, which is tangentially related to white nose, but it's not super related to white nose. And I wanted to know, like, we know that torpor is a temperature-dependent process. Bats use it less when it's hotter. And so I wanted to know, like, how exactly temperature was influencing that, and then whether that actually has cost to bats, and then how that scales up across like the continent. So is it just a problem with my species, or is it a widespread problem that like in a century or two, when it's 1 or 2 or 3 degrees warmer, like how is that going to affect bats during the summer? Are they going to be using torpor less and be skinnier because of it and have a harder time making it through hibernation because they're not carrying as much fat through the winter? Or are they going to be okay? And
bats are an interesting group of animals to study in relation to that, because when you're volant, when you can fly, you're kind of living on that knife's edge of like, I need to be fat enough to survive the winter, but not so fat that I can't fly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's tough.
Yeah, and it's neat because when you look at the data, so bats are really like small and skinny in the spring, and then they like get up to a comfortable weight, it seems like, over the course of the summer and kind of maintain that. And then in October, they're just like putting on the fat.
And the bats that you're looking at are mostly the insectivorous kind?
Yeah,
okay.
So in North America, all the bats are...
We don't have any of the big fruit-eating flying foxes?
No, there's a handful of bats that will eat fruit, but most of that happens in like Mexico or like the far southwest.
Yeah, those bats are pretty cool though. I really like the idea of this like 5-6 foot wingspan mammal.
Yeah.
Changing gears a little bit before we move on to the next section, I was looking at your website and I noticed that you have a whole section on just your passion, I guess I'll say, for open access science, and the paper we're getting ready to talk about in a minute was published through open access means. So do you want to like tell people a little bit about that and what kind of drives you to be this advocate for opening up science to more people?
Well, yeah. So, first I want to make a slight correction on that. So the paper we published in Biological Conservation is not open access. They open it up for kind of a brief window at the beginning so that they can kind of get a little bit of press out of it and that people can read it at that point in time. But so as a scientist, there's kind of a trade-off a lot of times between making it open to the public and then putting it behind a paywall, because we all want to make our research as open as possible. But to do that, you typically have to like pay a lot of money for that.
Yeah. We've talked about that on the podcast before, so people, hopefully listeners, if this is not their first episode, are familiar with that process as we've described it previously.
Okay, and so like this is a subscription journal, and we submitted our paper here because we were basically invited to submit a paper on kind of a broader topic for a special issue. But yeah, so open access is something that I'm really interested in and try to stay pretty well versed in. And what I think a lot of what gets left out of the conversation a lot of time is that there's a bunch of different ways that a paper can be open access. So the one that most people are familiar with is gold open access, by which you pay a fee to the publisher, and then they publish your paper and just kind of make it generally available. There's also green open access, where the publisher with a subscription model journal, they publish it to their usual subscribers, but then usually they allow you to publish some version of your paper on your website or on like an institutional repository. So like the University of Wyoming has one of those. And so you can send it to them. And so that way, like Google Scholar and I don't know if Web of Science can do this, but Google Scholar at least can find those PDFs. And so you can get some version of that paper. And so I recently submitted a paper. Hopefully it gets through the system, talking about some of those other ways that we can make things a little bit more open. And for me, I think the primary driver for open access for me is that in my field particularly, there's a whole bunch of conservationists who like rely on this stuff to do their job, but don't have access to it.
Yeah.
And so like I just got an email from a researcher this morning asking for a PDF of one of my papers, and so like that is like, it's pretty bad if people are relying on this knowledge and like can't get access to it.
Yeah.
It'd be like being a policeman without access to a police scanner.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I've not heard it put in those terms, because usually it's put in terms of very lofty, like science should be available to everyone, but you're talking about conservation, which is essentially a crisis discipline. Like it's constantly managing a house on fire, and we're hiding the data that they need to do their job, which I've never heard it put like that. That makes a lot of sense.
And a lot of people think that the problem is concentrated mostly in places outside of North America and Western Europe, where people just don't have the money to pay for these subscriptions. So if you're a researcher in Cameroon, your university is probably not going to buy a subscription that might cost thousands of dollars. And so it's going to be really hard for you to access this stuff. And a lot of people kind of couch it in that framework, but like I've been a conservation biologist for a while, and there are large parts of my career where I couldn't access stuff, either because I was unemployed or I was at a place that couldn't pay for the journal subscriptions or something like that. I know a bunch of like science journalists, they don't have access to this stuff, and they're like writing about this stuff and trying to make it more accessible to the public is their job. And if they don't have access to it, then like...
and then we sit around and complain that they get things wrong, and it's like, well, they didn't have a chance to read the paper. I don't know what we were expecting.
And so like there's a whole bunch of stakeholders, particularly in this field, that like it's really important that we get this information out. Like physics, I think that should be open too, and they seem to do a much better job of this stuff. But like if Joe Sixpack can't get access to like cutting edge physics research, then like that's probably not a huge net loss to society. But like, why shouldn't Joe Sixpack be able to get access to like papers about animals like deer, moose, things like that he really cares about and has a really vested interest in?
Mm-hmm. When the science is being done in your backyard.
Yeah.
That's a really good point.
And paid by your taxpayer dollars.
Yeah, that's the other big one, is that like you guys paid for this, you deserve to see the results of it. Okay, well with that, I think we're going to move over to our next segment, which is going to be very convenient because we're already sitting in a bar, so we'll be right back in just a moment with that. not be an episode of Science Sort of if we didn't also talk about what we are drinking. Joe, hit me.
All right. So a couple weeks back, maybe more than that, I don't remember when this was, but I was running a road rally. And as part of the road rally, I won the road rally. And so we got trophies and stuff. But they didn't hand out champagne, but they did hand out little bottles of Martinelli's sparkling white grape juice. And so I haven't drunk it yet, so I'm going to do that now. I'm just going to drink it from the bottle like a heathen.
No, for sure.
Whatever.
Yeah, I had to buy some... I was supposed to buy apple cider for a recipe, but like I didn't need a huge volume. I just needed a small volume, and the Martinelli's apple juice was the smallest volume I could get. So I got that instead of the cider.
Yeah, I mean, it's only an 8-ounce bottle, so...
Right. Well, and the recipe also had apple cider vinegar. So I'm like, I'm getting the cider in there somewhere because I got cider vinegar. I'm just going to use some apple juice.
So yeah, it's your standard Martinelli's. I'm sure most people have had it at some point in their life.
Are you a fan?
I am. I've always been a fan of Martinelli's.
I feel like Martinelli's was not a thing I knew about until like at least high school, maybe college.
We seemed to have it around. My mom would buy it at the holidays. Yeah,
I feel like it was a holiday thing. You would make punch with it, but I don't know that was ever a thing my family did.
I think my mom would buy it just as a substitute for like wine for the under 21 crowd.
Right.
You know.
Was there ever an age where you were under 21, but you got offered a glass of wine at the big family meals?
I think at some point, but I'm to this day I'm still not a wine guy.
So it didn't work.
No, not really.
Fair enough. Well, Joe, last time you were on the show, you had a rock and rye, I believe, flavored.
That sounds correct.
Soda beverage. So I was excited to have you back on today because my drink is a Hochstadter's Slow and Low Rock and Rye canned cocktail.
All right.
It's an extra dry, 84 proof, 100 milliliters can, union made with straight rye whiskey, raw honey, navel orange rock candy, and bitters.
Where did you find this?
So I first had this. This is, oh God, you've exposed me for what is about to be one of the most hipster statements ever said on this show.
Oh, I'm ready. Hit me.
I first had this at an indoor miniature golf course at a bar in San Francisco.
Mother of God. Get out your fedoras, ladies and gentlemen.
The place is a delight. It is a super fun golf course. It's like, who's the guy who did the overly intricate machines? Rube Goldberg. Mm-hmm. It's like a Rube Goldberg steampunk indoor. It's indoor, so like they don't have a ton of space. So everything is like super convoluted and twists and bends back on itself. And
right.
Oh, it's so much fun. So I had it there, and I'm attempting to do what they did at this bar, where an old fashioned is typically, whiskey, some sort of sweetener, some sort of bitter, and then some sort of fruit component. Sometimes it's like a muddled thing, like a citrus and a cherry. Other times, the type of old fashioned I prefer is just sort of a twist of orange and maybe a cherry. So what I did, which is what they did at this bar, is when you order an old fashioned, they have ice cubes that they've frozen a cherry and an orange peel into.
Nice.
And then they pour the cocktail over that. So I froze. I'm going to take a picture so I can post it. I froze a cherry and an orange slice into an ice cube, and then I'm going to pour the can over it. It's in my McMurdo glass that Abe and Bev got me when they were in Antarctica.
Nice. On brand.
Right.
Love it.
And I just thought you would be... Oh, God, it's so hipster. It's even got the pull tab style can topper.
I kind of want to try this drink.
I have another can. You want me to save it for you?
I mean, you might be saving it for a while.
That's okay. You'll be back in this region eventually.
I know you're an alcohol hoarder, so sure.
Ooh, it's good. It's because it's a little sweet, but the ice cube had already melted a little bit, and basically pouring the alcohol over it has caused it to melt quickly enough that the cherry is now kind of in a little moulin of an ice hole, and the orange peel is almost fully exposed. And most cocktails, I've been learning, like I knew this inherently, but I'd never heard it expressed mathematically. Most cocktails have an appropriate dilution factor that you're supposed to add through the action of mixing it with the ice, either shaking or stirring, an X% of water. Otherwise, the cocktail doesn't taste right, or it tastes too strong or too hot.
Right.
And obviously, the degree of dilution depends on the spirit. It depends on whether you're serving it with ice or if you're serving it without ice, and it depends on the preferences of the person drinking it. But it's a thing. It's an important. Water is an ingredient in cocktails that doesn't get talked about very often.
I believe it.
So yes, Joe, I will be happy to save my second can of this for you, and I will make you your own special ice cube.
Sweet.
Keep it in the freezer for the next time you're in town.
All right. It might not be until December, but
that's fine. I will be the designated driver. We will go karting, and I will make you have the cocktail right before we to give myself an advantage.
I think we need to find an indoor miniature golf course to stay on theme.
Joe, you think I haven't found an indoor miniature golf course here in the District of Columbia? Of course I have.
All right, well, we can go there.
I have 2 different hipster miniature golf courses for you. I have an indoor one at a bar, and then I have the oldest continuously operating miniature golf course on an island out in the Potomac that I can take you to as well.
Yeah, no, it has to be that one.
Which has very lax supervision, so if we wanted to also have a cocktail out there, that would be a thing we could probably brown bag pretty easily.
Nice.
All right, well, I think I'm going to drop in mine and Jesse's beers here at the end of Joe and I talking about our drinks, and then we will just kind of seamlessly glide right into the second half of my conversation with Jesse, where we're going to talk about the paper, where I sort of put myself out there. You know, Joe, you know that science is a self-correcting enterprise.
Indeed.
So this is me attempting to be a self-correcting podcaster, where I have proclaimed that I believe this idea of carnivore reintroduction and have promoted it here on this podcast, and to the point where we actually had somebody tweet at us that they were sort of dissatisfied with our handling of this topic.
Oh.
And it was after I had already recorded this interview, so I got to be like, well, actually, we're going to deal with that in a very... I tried not to actually it, but...
But you actually did.
I think I did. Let me see if I can find the tweet. I'll tell you about it. So in a previous episode, 306, I think was the last time that I had talked about sort of carnivore introduction, and it was an episode with Ben and Patrick on it. And we got a reply on Twitter from Kendal T that said, "Love the show, and yes, please find some guests with expertise in large predator ecology. That part was kind of hard to listen to. Not calling anyone wrong here, just encouraging a more scientific approach to an extremely important and complex problem." And so I replied with the Science Sort of account, which I'm not the only one who has access to the Science Sort of account, so it's not a guarantee that if you see a tweet from that account, it's me, but more than likely it's me.
High likelihood.
And so I replied to that, already recorded, stay tuned, and that led to a nice discussion about how we as podcasters and you as podcast listeners can kind of go back and forth on these topics. And I'm going to save that for the PaleoPOW because it sort of, I think, works better as a reflection on the rest of the interview that you're about to hear. So we're going to go drinks with Jesse, and then the rest of the interview coming up right now. Of Science Sort of, we didn't also talk about what we are drinking, and we happen to be at Coal Creek Tap, which is a place I've spent a lot of time in Wyoming, here in Laramie, just because it is one of the best places in town where you can work through that coffee to happy hour transition. So I would, go into the lab, get some lab work done, get antsy or get bored, and come here and drink coffee until it was time to have a beer. So I don't know, are you a fan? I know we're sitting here, so you kind of have to. But
yeah, so we actually last year, and I guess for the past 3 semesters, have had our lab meetings here.
Oh, nice.
And so it's a way to kind of lubricate the scientific process.
So basically the genesis of this podcast was, how do we have a conversation about science that sounds as close to like the lab happy hour, the departmental happy hour as possible, where like you're still talking about research, but it's casual, nobody's wearing a lab coat, nobody's at the lectern, that sort of thing. So I'm having the Wyoming Toad Rye IPA. I actually never thought to ask if it's based on any type of... Are there even that many amphibians that live in Wyoming?
There are a handful, and I think the Wyoming toad...
Is that a horny toad or something? I guess you'd be further south than that.
The Wyoming toad, from my understanding, is an endemic species of toad that only lives basically in the floodplain of the Laramie River.
Oh.
And so it is an endangered species. I'm not sure what the exact classification is.
Guess we can look it up.
But it was basically, I think, extinct in the wild until pretty recently. And then we found we thought it was, and then we found a relic population, and now we're trying to bring it back.
It's also called the Baxter's toad, an extremely rare amphibian that exists only in captivity and within the Mortenson Lake National Wildlife Refuge in Wyoming. Oh, spot on. That's cool. Yeah, it was extinct in the wild since 1991 until recently. I had no idea that I always just liked the beer. I like a rye IPA, and I don't know. I don't know if you're like this, where if something is marketed that with an animal involved in it, I tend to be a little more excited about it than I would be if it was marketed without. So
yeah, I think I do the same thing with labels. If it's got kind of a matte finish or it looks old, then I'm much more likely to buy it than if it's a shiny new.
So what are you having?
So I'm having the Molly. What is it?
Belgian Blonde?
Yeah, the Belgian Blonde. So I'm basically just kind of wishfully thinking that it's spring, and this seemed like a good spring beer.
As we sit here and it's literally snowing outside at the end of March, which I never knew where the name Molly came from, but now that they've started bottling their beers, I see that the label has a corgi on it, so I guess it's somebody's dog.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, well, with that, now that we've officially announced where we are and what we're drinking, let's move into our lab discussion of your paper. Okay, so the reason I wanted to have you on the show is I saw a tweet thread that you sent out a couple of days ago about this recent paper that you had come out. So this was published in the Journal of Biological Conservation, a special issue of the journal that you were asked to submit to, called Reciprocity and Restoration Ecology: When Might Large Carnivore Reintroduction Restore Ecosystems? You had a number of co-authors. All I have are their initials and last names, but if you want to shout out to any of them as we get into this discussion, that's totally great. We like to celebrate the collaborative nature of science. But yeah, let's talk about this paper. So I guess I'll start off by saying I've talked a lot about rewilding, specifically around the idea of Pleistocene rewilding, which I think is a bit more far out than the type of restoration ecology you're talking about. And I have been on record as saying I don't think it would work in the way that it's been proposed to work. And I think the best case scenario, if you actually tried to rewild, especially the American Pleistocene, is you would end up with what has been dubbed a Frankenstein ecosystem, where you're taking body parts and stitching them together and hoping that it functions like the ecosystem you imagine in the Pleistocene. But what you're talking about are some of the more recent efforts, like the Yellowstone wolf introduction. Oh, and the other thing I wanted to say is I have been on the record as also being very pro carnivore reintroduction, and I honestly don't remember if I've made some of the arguments that you talk about in this paper as part of my efforts to promote that, but it was one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show is because it's something I've talked about a lot and been on record as being in favor of. I didn't want to shy away from some of the nuances that come with that discussion and some of the things I might need to be corrected on. So I just wanted to start the discussion by putting up my own biases and preconceptions on the line there. So with that, can you kind of tell us what the idea behind this paper was?
Yeah, so everybody, all but one of our co-authors has a tie to Wyoming. And so I think everybody in Wyoming and a lot of people everywhere else is pretty familiar with the story of Yellowstone's wolves, right? Mm-hmm. Where Yellowstone's wolves were wiped out of Yellowstone in the 1920s, although they were pretty low in abundance at that point. So they were probably functionally extinct before that. And then in their absence, there were some pretty profound ecosystem changes, or at least there seemed to be, particularly with the things that the main prey of wolves there, elk, eat. And so a lot of willows, cottonwoods, and aspen in particular really got browsed down, and so there was not much recruitment and growth in those species while wolves were extinct. So in the mid-90s, wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone. They took hold really well.
It was 25 wolves from Canada were brought down and released.
Yeah, something like that. And then these wolves really took off. We have a pretty good data that they reduced the elk population, that increased the population of all these deciduous trees that these elk are eating, and seems to have some pretty good ecosystem and biological community level effects, where there's places where there's more songbirds, some stream hydrology change because primarily we think because beavers moved in because there's more forage for them.
Yeah, I want to get into that. I want to talk about some of the confounding effects you point out when it comes to the wolf reintroduction.
And so this was like heralded kind of nationwide as this like huge conservation success story, where we without doing anything except reintroducing wolves, we brought back the system to what we think it was in 1850 or 1800 or before we messed it up. And by we, I mean white people.
Yeah.
And so this is a pretty widely renowned, it's like a really popular kind of ecological success story. And I think a lot of ways it really is. But our lab group got together, and we're scientists. What we're supposed to do is figure out, we're supposed to test ideas with data, right? And this is like a really cool idea with a lot of anecdotal evidence. So we wanted to go out and test, like, did this happen in Yellowstone, and is it like a general phenomenon in other places too? And so we were looking for like really rigorous experimental studies, preferably. But really we were just looking for data on similar large carnivore reintroduction events and seeing, does like the ecosystem always rebound in the way that we think that it did in Yellowstone. We looked for that data pretty extensively. We didn't really find any of it. So like we couldn't find a paper that had estimates of biomass or abundance at connected trophic levels for both before predators were extirpated, during the extirpation, and post-extirpation.
And so kind of to break that down a little bit, when you say biomass, you're just meaning the amount of animals at a given levels, the amount of prey, the amount of predators, the amount of prey feed, so herbivore, plants basically. So biomass is your way of quantifying the relative abundance or success of each of these different groups, and then you need it over these 3 time bins. You need before anything went wrong, during the thing going wrong, and then when we tried to fix it, when we put the Band-Aid on it.
Exactly. And so we looked for that data. We couldn't find it, and so we expanded we kind of broadened our net so that we looked for any reintroduction event of a native apex predator that had been extirpated. So not just large carnivores. If there's an apex predator that was a fish, for example, or if like
a pike or something?
Yeah, I think even one of our papers includes humans as an apex predator, and it's like in a fisheries context. And so humans are like at the top of the food chain, catching everything. What happens when like a protected area is proclaimed in that area and like we can't fish there anymore? And so we expand our net for that.
Well, that's so funny. I didn't think about it in that context. So essentially that's something that as a conservationist you would promote, but most of the time when we talk about carnivore restoration, we're talking about putting carnivores back in the environment.
Yeah.
So there are times where the removal effect can be of the benefit to the ecosystem.
Yeah, and so we looked at both reintroductions and removal events.
And that was another thing you point out, because you basically said if the predictions are true, then those two things should work in exactly opposite directions.
Yeah.
And they should be balanced. It should be a balanced equation, basically. And that was something you wanted to test because nobody else had really tested it.
Yeah. So we included these removal events of invasive apex predators too, exactly for that reason. And when we did that, we still didn't have a ton of data. We found 20 papers. A lot of those papers had a bunch of data points within them. But in these 20 papers, we found that basically you can't predict the way that this trophic cascade is going to happen to affect things further down the food chain. So sometimes you get it really nice and predictably, sometimes you don't. And we found even sometimes where it responded in the opposite direction of what we thought it was going to. And so I think that has really big implications for large carnivore restoration, because if we're trying to justify these things on the basis of their ecosystem effects, then like that could potentially be counterproductive in the long term.
Yeah, and you mentioned that, and we'll loop back around to that when we kind of wrap things up. But you did also find that there's a strong mesopredator effect, and that seemed to be the one consistent sort of thing that happened. So can you explain what mesopredators are in the terms of your system, and then what that effect that the carnivore removal or reintroduction was having on them?
Yeah, so mesopredators in a large carnivore context are things like foxes and coyotes and raccoons and possums.
So where wolves are the big dogs on top, the middle dogs, raccoons, coyotes, those kind of...
Yeah, and so these things they're also predators, but they are much less big, and they're subject to some sort of regulation usually by things above them on the chain, because they get eaten by predators or compete directly with predators, but they're much smaller, so they don't do as well. And this has actually been a pretty consistent finding by other people too, is that when you remove large carnivores or apex predators, a lot of times you get this mesopredator release where these guys aren't regulated by the apex predators anymore, and so they just take off.
My favorite example of this is areas with coyotes have healthier bird populations because the coyotes manage outdoor cat. So the coyotes are essentially functioning as the apex predator, and they're having a dampening effect on cat predation upon birds.
Yeah, I've seen the same thing in quail studies in somewhere in the southeast. They showed that. And then my favorite example of this was feral cats and rats and birds. And so if you just get rid of feral cats without taking care of the rats, then the bird populations actually decrease, because rats affect birds even more strongly than cats do.
Because rats are probably going after like the nest. Right?
Yeah.
Getting back to the Wyoming or the Yellowstone example a little bit, what were those other effects that were happening around the same time that the wolves were introduced that you mentioned might be confounding variables in this story that we tend to tell pretty simply? So I think a lot of the work of science, especially like ecosystem science, is, and you mentioned this in the paper too, we tend to oversimplify things. And so, like, can you expound on some of the complexity that was present that we kind of gloss over?
Yeah, so it's really hard because, one, you get invasive species can come in, even ones that you don't think will have any effects at all. So in Yellowstone, there's a lot of evidence, and some other people at the University of Wyoming just recently came out with a paper that showed that lake trout have really disrupted the terrestrial Yellowstone ecosystem because they've reduced populations of cutthroat trout, which grizzly bears eat, and some raptors and things like that. And so with fewer cutthroat trout, it's causing cascading changes throughout the system.
And then you also mentioned that beavers were reintroduced to Yellowstone around the same time as wolves, like the archetypal ecosystem engineer, like literally changing the landscape by building structures that last for hundreds of years.
I think it was more a natural recolonization than a reintroduction event,
sorry.
although it may have been assisted by humans too. I'm not sure.
But then you also mentioned there was like a drought and there were fires, and so there was a lot of like stuff happening around the park besides just the wolves being reintroduced.
Yeah, and it's really hard with ecological studies, particularly with like large carnivores that range over this huge space, to experimentally isolate like exactly what their predation effect is versus all this other stuff. And so a lot of the studies in the past have been kind of correlational, which is some evidence, but like we really need this strong experimental evidence to try to isolate this stuff to make sure that's exactly what's going on.
So if you had unlimited funding and could design the perfect study to tackle these open questions, like what would you put together to really hone in on the effect of either the removal or the reintroduction?
That's it's a really hard thing to do. I think some people have done a pretty good job with some of this with exposure experiments.
What are those?
So basically you're putting a fence up to keep something out. And so you have areas where in this area we have no herbivores because like we put chicken wire around a kilometer area and like none of the herbivores can climb over this wire.
And that's like really classic ecology.
Yeah.
It's like 2 plots, different treatment, see what the changes are.
Yeah, or you can experimentally remove predators, although that's quite a bit harder. And so I think those types of experiments are kind of the gold standard at this point, although they're really hard and really expensive to do.
You mentioned this a little bit in your paper, but what's the effect of time? Because a lot of time, as a person who does paleoecology, I would never say that ecology or ecological studies of the modern world are short-sighted, but they tend to just be limited to a much shorter time scale than I'm used to dealing with. And so you mentioned it a little bit, but like what in your mind, what role does the longevity or the length of these sort of removals or exclusions or reintroductions play in the story?
Yeah, so we had a hypothesis that we thought about testing that we weren't really able to test because the data wasn't just there. We wanted to see whether the length of the extirpation event affected the strength of the trophic cascade once it goes back, because the longer an animal's gone, the more likely it is that the ecosystem changes while it's away. So we wanted to test that. We couldn't really do that. We still think there's a pretty good theoretical basis for that, but we need more studies to find out. Another thing is that once you reintroduce predators, it's not just like instantaneously everything is perfect again. Like it takes trees a long time to grow.
Yeah.
It takes these predator populations often a really long time to come back into where they're functionally present on the landscape, and then even longer often to come back to the point where they're at anything close to carrying, what we think of as carrying capacity.
Yeah, I mean, the biologists I talked to at Yellowstone, the guys who specifically work with the carnivores, mostly like the mountain lions and the wolves, said that they think it's only been within the past couple of years that sort of the predator-prey populations have leveled out to what they would expect from a natural system. And they were reintroduced in the early 90s, so it takes 20 plus 30-ish years maybe to really get to that level.
Yeah, and it probably takes even longer with, like, wolves can have...
And Yellowstone's relatively small on a continental scale, so if you're thinking...
and wolves can have 5 or 6 pups a year, and so if there's plenty of food, then a lot of those pups can survive and become new packs and things. Things like mountain lions, I think, typically only have a couple of kits a year. Wolverines only have a couple of kits every 2 years. So there's a lot of species that are going to take even longer than that.
It's always a little tougher for weasels. Weasels have, their limitations on body size when they're giving birth and stuff. We talked about it on the show. I have an inordinate fondness for weasels. So there's time effects, generation times, things like that, just the time it takes for trees to grow. And then the fact that, like, of all the ecosystems out there, Yellowstone is a pretty well-managed one just in terms of not having overdevelopment of humans, so you're not having these outside effects of, like, land use development, roads, deforestation.
Yeah, and there's some invasive plants in the area, but there's not a whole lot of invasive mesopredators and things like that some studies in Europe have shown that when you bring in invasive mesopredators, that really changes the ecosystem pretty quickly.
And that was another thing I wanted to mention is that, like, when you remove the predator, when you extirpate the predator, which is just, I guess, our fancy science word for local extinction or by killing, if there's an open niche, something's going to try to fill it if it can. And then I think something I think about a lot with ecosystems, or you see it a lot in evolutionary biology, once there's something stably occupying that niche, it can actually be pretty hard to disrupt it, even if you're trying to disrupt it with the thing that was in the niche before. Like, there tends to be sort of this memory effect or this, like, stability where, like, ecosystems want to maintain the momentum of what they were doing, and any attempt to disrupt that or to rejigger that in some way is going to be met with almost sort of just a passive resistance by the ecosystem itself. Do you think am I talking crazy, or is that maybe a...
No, I think that's a good point, and I think we've seen that, like, out east, we've extirpated wolves a long time ago. Coyotes have come in, and I think now there's some evidence that coyotes are getting bigger and kind of doing things that wolves historically did, whereas they weren't present at all in the landscape 100, 200 years ago.
Yeah. So to sort of wrap up the idea of the paper is basically you tested our story against the actual data available and found that the story was maybe a little bit wanting, right? So what would you say is the take-home message from there that you want people to remember when they think about this work?
Well, there's two. So one is that we need more data to really be able to conclusively say this happens or this doesn't happen. Like, maybe it happens, but in these sets of circumstances, maybe it happens, but the effect is much smaller than we thought it was, so we just didn't have the sample size to detect it. There's a lot of different ways that it can happen, but we just didn't have the data to pick it up. And then there's also a lot of ways where it doesn't happen, and what we found is actually an accurate part of the picture. And so we really need more data to test this. The kind of second thing is that we shouldn't be relying on this kind of weird bank shot justification for reintroducing large carnivores and saying we should reintroduce large carnivores because it will help aspen, for example. Like, we should be reintroducing large carnivores so we can help large carnivores.
Right.
Like, they're cool in and of themselves. We don't need to justify it by these other things that might be a little bit more politically tenable.
So at the end of the day, you are still pro large carnivore reintroduction, which I am too. It's just the justification that we give for it needs to be sound. And if you're justifying it based on ecosystem effects, you might be selling a false narrative, and then it gives the people who are against it a reason to deny your desire to reintroduce large carnivores. Whereas if you just say, no, I just think ecosystems need large carnivores and they're cool and deserve our conservation efforts, then they don't have that tool to potentially use against us, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I'm definitely pro all of these large carnivores. I just think that we need to be thinking about it in terms of benefit for large carnivores rather than benefit for all these other things.
So what comes next? Do you plan on pursuing these ideas further? Are you going to wrap up your bat and moose stuff? Where is kind of your research heading in the future?
Yeah, so I my immediate priorities are finishing up my bat and moose research and a couple of other side projects I've got.
I'm kind of imagining a Bullwinkle Batman crossover now in my head, and I think that would be really fun. But
yeah, with Batman as the Boris and
Natasha, yeah.
But yeah, so my immediate priority is that stuff coming up. But I think this is definitely something that we could revisit in coming years, and we're hoping that our paper. A lot of times in science, it's easy to get defensive over like this is my turf and all that kind of stuff. But like we're really hoping that a bunch of other people like take off and run with this idea, and like maybe they find some data that we just couldn't find.
You even list a bunch of questions. Like, what are the open questions still that are still needed to be answered to really make this research, more impactful? I thought that was a really cool way to kind of wrap things up.
Yeah. So like we're hoping that more people go out and look for data in case that there's stuff that we missed. We think that we hope that more people go out and actually do these studies in really strong, rigorous ways so that we have more data that we can look at this stuff with. We hope people look at the contingency part of this so that once we have more data, when does this happen, when does it not happen, that kind of stuff. And so it's not going to be like necessarily the focus of my career, but like I think in 10, 15, 20 years, like I'm hoping that we can revisit this question and like get a much more firm answer of not only does this happen or does it not happen, but in what kind of context does that.
Cool. And then in terms of the outreach that you do, you seem to be very active on Twitter. So your Twitter handle is Integrat Ecology?
Yeah, it's integrate ecology, but with one E instead of two there.
That's why I said Integrat. Yeah. And what kind of stuff do you usually just tweet about science, or is it more just about your life in general? Or
yeah, a lot of it's science. I follow politics pretty closely, and policy in particular really closely, and so I tweet a lot about some kind of, I guess, niche interest of mine: mass transit, housing. Weird things that don't really apply in Laramie.
Yeah, I was going to say mass transit in Laramie, but there's not enough mass to transit. And then you also have a website, JM Alston, where people can read more about your research. You see your CV so they can go find all the publications that you worked on. And then you said you've taken a bit of a hiatus, but I do want to go ahead and promote the fact that you have a podcast as well, the Field Surveys podcast. Do you want to tell people, give a quick plug for what that show's about? Because even though it's on hiatus, all the episodes are still available.
Yeah, and so Field Surveys is a podcast I started when I started grad school. I went off the idea of kind of long-form interviews. Two podcasts I really like are the Tim Ferriss Show and the Ezra Klein Show, and they just find somebody they think is really smart and talk to them about the stuff that they're smart about for an hour or two. And so I kind of want to replicate that with conservationists and ecologists and give people an idea, one, of what ecologists and conservationists do, two, that they're human, they're not just science robots.
That's a big part of our show,
and
too.
And three, just try to integrate, science in the same way that you're trying to do, trying to get some of these messages out there. Because a lot of scientists are really good about talking about their research when you ask them about it, because they're humans, they have spouses, children, family, friends that aren't scientists, so they know how to talk about their stuff. Mm-hmm. They just don't get the forum to do that a whole lot of the time.
So that's available wherever people normally get their podcasts. So likely wherever you're getting our podcast from right now, they can also get Field Surveys, which is cool. Anything else you want people to know about you, your work, we'll link to everything, your Twitter, your website, and your podcast on the show notes for this episode. But is there just anything else you want people to know?
Yeah. So a lot of times the first author gets credit for all these studies, but I want to point out that this was a team effort. I had 8 other co-authors, I think, from 3 institutions who put in a ton of work on this stuff. So science takes a lot of people. If you have a lot of people, it usually makes the research better because you have more eyes on it, more people vetting it. 2 people that particularly helped with this are Brian Maitland, who is actually a fish researcher at the University of Wyoming. He comes to our lab meetings and has brought a pretty interesting perspective because a lot of times the terrestrial ecologists don't talk with aquatic ecologists that much. And so that's part of the reason that we included aquatic data points in our data paper. Another one's my advisor, Jake Goheen. He is conspicuously not online. He has a website. Brian has a Twitter, is pretty active on that. Both of these people put in a lot of work. And then my other co-authors put in a lot of work too. I guess the one that's most active on social media is Adam Ford. He does a ton of stuff, so you should look him up. He's got an infrequent Saturday morning ecology with pancakes SciComm initiative that I think is pretty funny, where he illustrates habitat connectivity and things like that while making pancakes for his kids in the morning.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I work with a lot of great people here. Some of them are on this paper, some of them aren't, and so you should make sure that everybody out there follows those guys too.
Yeah, and if you end up publishing stuff in the future, you're always welcome back on the show, and thanks so much for giving us some of your time.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks for inviting me.
All right, thanks again to Jesse for giving me some of his time. Go check out, especially Twitter, where Jesse seems to be the most active, but he also has his own podcast that you have some episodes you can go listen to, and hopefully more coming in the future, as well as his website. And then, he's a strong advocate for open access or open science. And so hopefully most of the research that he has published and will continue to publish will be accessible to you fine folks out there in podcast land. So with that, if you have feedback about anything we've talked about so far or anything we've talked about in the 310 episode history of this show, let us know, and you just might get featured on our final segment, which is the PaleoPOW. The PaleoPOW is the final segment of the show where we invite and celebrate feedback from the listeners. I'm going to start off by finishing sort of the thread that Kendal started when we were going back and forth about predator ecology and sort of the admonition and encouragement to do a little bit better job on that. Hopefully, the rest of this episode has demonstrated that we tried to do that, but if there's still room to improve there, we're welcome to hear that. But I did want to say one of the things that we responded about that interaction was sort of saying, but also, no one is ever satisfied when we talk about a topic they know more about than us. It's just the reality of doing a podcast like this one, where we try to talk about a broad array of different scientific topics. So I just wanted to say publicly, not to Kendal directly, but to the people looking at our Twitter and not everyone listening to the podcast, like, I think it's important to keep in mind that the spirit of the show that we do is to always be about learning more than we knew before. Sometimes that process of learning is painful because you have to correct mistakes you've made or undo things that you thought before. But like, our goal is always to be learning. And so if we're talking about a topic that you are an expert in and we're getting things wrong, that's valid and we want to hear from you, but like, tone is also an issue. And it's never fun to be chastised, even if it's well-meaning, but it's fun to like learn more with your friends. And so I hope that that's the sort of attitude that we engender here on the podcast amongst our listeners and each other. And so that's just sort of the spirit I want things moving forward in. And Kendal was super amenable to that and said, absolutely didn't intend to come off as overly critical. Conservation's a complex issue. Talking about how like hunters are active conservationists and supporters of the science, they're self-included, looking forward to learning more. And I, from the Science Orb Twitter account said, like, you didn't come across as overly critical, but I just want to put out that sentiment so that everyone reading along with this and now listening along with this could see that that's sort of where we're coming from and what we hope to do. Would you agree, Joe?
Yeah, definitely.
So with that out of the way, I mean, I thought that was a really healthy and positive interaction, and I was happy to have it. I just kind of wanted to just like all be on the same page of like learning and sharing and growing and friendship.
Yes.
Amigo-ness, Joe.
Amigo-ness.
Now that we've got that out of the way, why don't you tell us about war?
All right, let's bring the let's bring the room down a little bit.
We're going to bring it down so we can build it back up. We're going to remove the predator and then put them back in and hope everything goes well.
Right. All right, let's do it. Okay, so we had an email from Karl,
Karl.
Yeah. Where is Karl?
London.
Yeah. Karl is in London, as signed in the email. Okay. So Karl writes, this is a bit ago, so I'm not sure what episode he was referring to, but he says, "Hey guys, just thought I would get in touch after what was said during the drop keystroke virus." So I assume you guys were talking about that virus back in the day. He says, "I find it slightly insulting to the people in uniform who go through pretty much hell and back to have their job put down to the, quote, Call of Duty generation or, quote, it's a video game."
Oh, so we were talking about the virus that got into the drone center in Nevada.
Oh, okay.
So there's that drone flight center outside Las Vegas where it's like a giant warehouse and everybody's piloting drones all the time. And I think we were talking about how a virus got in there, and because the system is like so cut off from outside influence and internet, like it's unclear how it got in, probably somebody's thumb drive, but also like it's hard. You can't really scrub it out of the system because the system doesn't have a lot of redundancy or backups and isn't connected to the internet. So you can't like just download an antivirus.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I don't think maybe we were, but I don't think we were disparaging the people who are out there flying drones. I think we've talked before about how like those people suffer from PTSD at similar rates to other types of service members. So yeah, so I think that's the context of what this email is referring to.
Gotcha. Yeah, the life of a drone pilot is not necessarily easy. There was a movie about it. I think it might have been called just Drone or something, but it was Ethan Hawke was in it.
Oh.
Anyway, it's worth a watch. It's not the best movie in the world, but it's worth a watch. Anyway, Karl continues, "It shows neither understanding nor knowledge of the life in uniform. This may not have been your guys' intent, and I dare say it wasn't, but that's how it comes across." So I'm guessing it was not, but we apologize for that. Anyway, Karl continues to come to the point of the value of life. We don't value life now, and we have humans fighting humans. If we did, we wouldn't be having battles and wars in the first place. It only seems that the only one who doesn't want to go to war is the soldier. If the transition is made to that of robots, instead of it being a human cost, one that can't be replaced, it will be nothing more than a financial one, writing off damage and lost units like you would write off a car after a crash, etc. What value or taboo will there be to war when it just becomes product versus product? War is a terrible act, one in which humanity is at its lowest point, where all of our ideas, thoughts, and dreams have been smashed, and we must step on the stage and be Death, the Destroyer of Worlds, once more. It is something that should not and never be easy to act out. Thanks for the podcast, Karl in London. So yeah, thanks for the email, Karl.
And this is something I think about, like as war becomes not automated, but as it becomes disconnected, the drone pilot in Nevada is experiencing war in a different way than somebody who's deployed overseas. And even though the PTSD and the other psychological effects of war are present, like the risk of death it's a different calculus, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's not to say there is no cost. I'm not saying that the cost is zero. I'm just saying the cost is different.
Right. Yeah, yeah, definitely. And it is worth noting that the next extension of, where this type of weapon system is going is probably leading towards some sort of AI, right?
Yeah.
Where there is not necessarily a human directly in the loop. So, to take it one step further, it gets a little bit scarier on towards the world of Terminator, right?
But isn't the idea that like, as long as it's our robots, the mythic hour, I'm not like referring to the US in particular, although for all intents and purposes.
You might as well.
Yeah. As long as it's our robots and their soldiers, like I think once it becomes our robots versus their robots, then maybe things change. But as long as they don't have the robots, and again, it's the mythic they, I'm not referring to any, singular entity. And
that will be the calculus for a while, right?
Are we that? I mean, because we're that far ahead, or it's just the technological availability isn't quite scalable or dispersed yet, I guess.
Yeah, I think that you've got the United States and peer states, right? Like Russia, China, what have you. And mutually assured destruction is probably still a concept that prevents conflict from breaking out between U.S. and the peer states. So what you have most likely in the future is probably U.S. conflict against non-peer state, wherein you have robots fighting humans effectively. And so that's just a very lopsided argument, which makes it morally questionable, I guess. I don't know.
Well, it's tough because
difficult.
as the person deciding whether or not like the choice between deploying a robot and deploying a human, like from your side's perspective, deploy the robot, like because
right, absolutely,
the human life on your team. Like is it the Patton quote that says like the point of war isn't to die for your country, it's to let the other poor bastard die for his.
Right, and it what it does is it basically makes the bar for, to use the most mechanical terms possible, prosecuting a target that much higher, right? Like you want to really know for sure. And the problem with using a robot is that you don't necessarily have that perspective of somebody on the ground, right?
Yeah.
The advantage of having humans against humans is that those humans are there. They're up close and personal with whatever's going on. Now, fast forward to, I don't know, walking robots. It's a different story, but the current world is just basically UAVs.
This sort of reminds me of the idea of like the removal of humans from war, or at least humans that we put value in. There's the story of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how like these 300 soldiers stood against an entire invading army and managed to hold the line or whatever. Kieran Gillen, who's a really good comic book writer of some note that hopefully, people, if you're familiar with comics at this point, you've heard of him, did Phonogram and is currently doing Wicked and Divine and has done a bunch of other. He just finished this run on Peter Cannon Thunderbolt that was just like a bizarre sequel / commentary on Watchmen, like one of the most celebrated comics of all time. So he wrote this book a couple of years ago called 3, and it's a riff on 300 because it's about the idea that the 300 Spartan soldiers were all supported by not just one, but each soldier was supported by multiple slaves of different slave classes that existed in that region at the time. And in his book 3, 3 of those slaves from the Helot, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, classes run away after the battle. They were like, that sucked. We're bailing.
We're out.
So now these 3 slaves have an entire Spartan army coming after them because they've abandoned the fight, but they weren't being treated like humans anyway. Because they were just considered as slaves, as fodder, essentially. They were just there to support the glorified soldiers.
Right.
So I almost wonder if, we're just at the 2 tail ends of a bell curve, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of like, maybe there was this period where we thought about soldiers as one way, and now maybe that's reverting back to a more previous time, or maybe this is a true evolution of our idea of what it means to go to war.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a tricky question. Probably requires a lot more philosophy thought to it. But the movie I was referencing is called Good Kill. It came out in 2014.
So did 3 by Kieran Gillen.
Aw, snap.
So apparently, Karl, go back to 2014 and we can answer this question better.
Yeah. But it does actually give you a good look at how that job affects a person.
Yeah, and again, we don't remember exactly what we said back in that episode. One of the themes recently of the PaleoPOW has been like, hey, we don't 100% recall everything we've said in the 300 plus history of this show, but obviously never our intention to insult people out there doing a tough job. So if that's how it came across, our bad. And hopefully, again, we can all grow and learn and do better and figure this out.
Can all be best.
Be best. Never has that sentiment been put. Did you just come up with that, Joe? That was great.
Yep. I don't know where I would have come up with something that outstanding.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate it. That idea was so good, Joe. I almost feel like you bullied me by saying it.
Oh, I would never do such a thing because I'm be best.
Yeah, that wouldn't be best of you to do that.
Right. Exactly.
Okay. I have a much more uplifting email, if I may transition us to a lighter fare.
Yes, please.
Okay. I'm going to read this emailer's full name because I do not believe it is their actual name, and the name that was included in the email is a delight. So this is a message from Zoe Sparkles. She writes, "Hey guys, I'm a high schooler from Oregon who listens to your podcast on my walks to and from school. I started listening with my parents, who are great science lovers, a few years back. At the end of episode 307, Laughing All the Way to the Lab, one of the PaleoPOWs was talking about dreams, and you all suggested making that a topic of conversation in future episodes. Although you aren't directly studying dreams, I enjoy listening to you talk about science and would love to hear at least a segment about the science of dreams. Anyways, I love the podcast and hope I'll be as excellent a scientist as everyone on the podcast is. Thanks, Zoe."
Thanks, Zoe. And thanks Zoe's parents for introducing Zoe to science, sort of.
Right? And for living in some sort of weird mythical version of the past where a person can walk to and from school.
Yeah.
Because I don't think that was ever an option in my entire childhood.
Really?
It sounds lovely. I tried to bike to school, I think when I was in like 5th grade. And I did it for a few days until I fell on my way to school and then showed up with like some road rash and didn't want to do it anymore.
Oh, that's unfortunate.
Yeah.
I grew up with my elementary school in my backyard, so I just walked across the field.
Wow.
It was real convenient.
Did you listen to podcasts?
Not then at the time, no. Had to wait for podcasts to be invented.
So I guess I read this email because I think, Joe, you and I both pay attention to like science news generally, and we kind of have a topic thread on the Slack for the show about like things that might be good to talk about. I don't know that I've ever seen a story or come across anything that's actual science about dreaming.
Yeah, I don't know that I've ever seen something come across the feed.
So normally I would save an email like this for a time when we had like a story to talk about that's like, hey, here's something about the science of dreaming. But I just don't know that that's feasible. And I just thought this email was delightful and made me feel good. So I wanted to go ahead and read it out now. So I guess I will read it out and say, if you or anyone you know is an actual scientific studier of dreams or even sleep, it'd be cool to talk to. You should get in touch with us.
Sleep and dreams are weird. If I remember anything from my AP Psych class in high school, which was a long time ago at this point, dreams are like a memory dump that happens in no particular order, apropos of nothing at all.
I know we don't have to do it anymore now that we're all using flash drives, but remember when you had to use to optimize or defrag? You had to defrag your drive? Yeah. I almost wonder, like, that to me always seemed like what dreams are. It's like defragging things. It's like taking all the bits and pieces of memory and like sorting them into the best order, but in doing so, they flash through your subconsciousness temporarily.
Yeah. It's basically your brain going through the items of the day.
Yeah.
Whether they happened or you just thought about them. That's the theory I remember it being from AP Psych.
The thing that breaks that for me, though, and maybe that doesn't actually break it, it shifts the discussion slightly for me, is that like I don't play a ton of video games. I go through phases where I'll like get into a game and I'll play it on the weekends. I'm pretty good about avoiding things on weekdays when I gotta get work done. But like if I play it on the weekend, I'll spend a few hours playing the game. Like I'll do that at the expense of going and seeing a movie or something like that. And there are times where like when I go to sleep, I'll just dream back in the game world.
Oh yeah, I think that lines up with the theory.
It doesn't feel like it does though. It feels different.
You spent all day in the game.
I know.
In the world of the game, and then you go to sleep and your brain is like, where were we today? Well, we were in Boston after a nuclear bomb went off.
It wasn't that game, but it was similar. There were also zombies involved.
Well, it's that game for me, okay?
It was State of Decay 2 for me most recently.
Gotcha. That's terrifying.
Yeah, no, but I like a zombie game.
All right.
Zoe, I have no doubt you'll be an excellent scientist.
Yeah, for sure.
Once you decide what kind of science you want to pursue, please do keep in touch and let us know what your plans are for the future, because it sounds like you got a great future ahead of you. Unless zombies. You might still be fine. The future will not be as great, and I'm not sure the American university system will survive a zombie apocalypse.
Fast forward 10 years. Zoe's working as a research scientist at the Umbrella Corporation.
Oh no! Zoe caused it. Or did she cure it? One of the two. We haven't done a patron thesis for the last couple of episodes because we haven't had the normal crew here recording these segments. And so whenever we do a show where there's an interview and Joe hasn't heard the interview yet, but he knows what it's about, we save the patron thesis to the end of the show so that we can use whatever nonsense Joe and I just talked about to inform the thesis. So this time we have a thesis for Tom D, and here's the tricky part, because Tom already has a PhD. I know this about Tom.
Oh, sneaky.
Tom has been a longtime listener, longtime writer, writes often. We've met up when he was in DC, had lunch. Also a comic book guy, listens to the iFanboy show. So yeah, Tom kind of works in environmental science, policy, sociology, animal studies, earth change, earth observation systems, that sort of thing. So I thought thought he would be a good choice for the interview, but then I figured we would get up to some nonsense, as I said before.
Much nonsense was had.
So what are you thinking?
Well, Tom is studying satellite tracking of zombie hordes and their interaction.
What about zombie reintroduction?
Zombie okay, sure. Zombie reintroduction. Okay. Monitoring of zombie reintroduction to the New California Republic via unmanned aerial vehicle. Tie them all in.
What? Where was the? Oh, yeah, gotcha.
No,
I like that. I like that.
We can just science it up somehow.
Yeah. Let's see.
Aerial monitoring we could do.
Well, it's already unmanned aerial vehicle. That's aerial twice in the same thesis.
True.
All right. How about monitoring the sociological impacts of zombie reintroduction to the sustainability of the New California Republic via unmanned aerial vehicles and surveys of school children walking to and from school.
I like the end there.
And I included, in parentheses after New California Republic, I put NCR, and after unmanned aerial vehicle, I put UAV.
Nice. Can we make it like Sparkles Watch?
Oh, man.
Sparkles Watch :
Sparkles would have to be an acronym, and that's going to make it real long, because Sparkles is a long word.
What? Sparkles. Oh, man, this is getting long. So basically I'm saying put Sparkles Watch : at the front of all that.
That doesn't make any sense, though.
Yeah, we're keeping an eye on Zoe Sparkles going to school. Make sure she doesn't get eaten by a zombie. Of course, she doesn't live in the NCR, so.
We don't know what Oregon's status is at this point.
Right. Monitoring the sociological impacts of zombie reintroduction to the sustainability of the New California Republic NCR via unmanned aerial vehicles, UAV, and surveys of school children walking to and from school. I don't know. The last part just seems tacked on.
Yep. That's because it is. Trying to figure out a way to make Sparkles an acronym.
How about what if oh, I see what you're trying to do. What if it was monitoring the sociological impacts of zombie reintroduction on school children walking to and from school in the New California Republic?
There you go.
Yeah, unmanned aerial vehicles.
To the sustainability of school walking routes for students of the New California Republic. There it is. You did it. Joe, you fixed it.
Crushed it.
And then I think maybe we just call it the Sparkles Initiative.
Yeah, that works.
Or is that dumb?
I mean, it's all dumb, so yeah.
Is it too dumb, though?
I mean, I don't think so.
I think it's just dumb enough the way it is.
Okay, I'm good with it.
Monitoring the sociological impacts of zombie reintroduction to the sustainability of school walking routes for the students of the New California Republic via unmanned area vehicles. Good job, Tom.
Nice work.
I hope the children survive your experiment. When you release zombies to go get them.
I feel like there's all kinds of ethical problems with this study, but
that's for Tom. I don't know that Aya Cook survived the event.
The apocalypse. Yeah.
What do they call it in the Fallout series? Just the war, right?
Yeah, the war. Before the war.
War never changes, Joe.
That's what I hear.
That is what I hear as well. But Joe, we've changed.
Yeah.
I think we're sadder but wiser now.
Yeah, I'll go with that.
That's the hero's journey.
There you go.
We've returned from the abyss, sadder but wiser. Oh, that reminds me, I got a thing to plug. Do you have a thing to plug, Joe?
No.
Okay.
I have no things to plug anymore.
Well, I hope that the things you did plug made you happy.
They went well, so.
Good.
Yeah.
I recently was invited and accepted the invitation to write a review for Science Magazine's Books et al. Segment, which is a segment included in Science Magazine where people review books. And I was part of a series looking at the Scientist Summer Reading List, and I was given the book Underland, A Deep Time Journey by Robert Macfarlane, who's a British author, and it's all about sort of his journeys into the different underground spaces around the world. So mines that extend out under the ocean, the root networks between trees, the deep sea fishing grounds that we're also considering for oil exploitation, the holes that form from the tops of glaciers that kind of melt their way all the way through down to the very depths of this ice that hasn't, seen sun or fresh air for hundreds of thousands of years. So just really cool explorations of any sort of idea of what it means to be underground.
Cool.
So it was a really cool book, and I wrote a review of it, and so I will link to that review in the show notes for this episode, and go check out my review, and then if you think my review looked good, go check out the book, and if you want to buy the book, where should they go buy it, Joe?
I would suggest Amazon via our Amazon
actually
affiliate.
A local bookstore was the correct answer.
Damn it.
But if your local bookstore doesn't stock this book, Amazon is a fine alternative, especially if, or maybe only if, you use our Amazon affiliate link, because what happens when they do that, Joe?
We get a piece of it.
Yes, take it out of Jeffy Bezos' pockets. Make sure that his space launch is underfunded by nearly 5 to 10 cents, and give that to us instead. And we will appreciate it.
Also, we get page 146. It's weird. It's a weird system, but we literally get a piece of the book.
Just, email us and let us know you need us to read that to you, and we'll send you a recording of Joe reading that to you.
That's a higher level Patreon sponsorship.
True. So you can support the show by using our Amazon affiliate link. We can accept a PayPal donation directly if you think, I don't want that book, but I want them to have the amount of money that it would have cost me to buy that book because I liked the review so much. I just hate the idea of reading the book. Don't know why you'd feel that way, but you're allowed. It's valid. We support you. And then also, if you want to help the show in a recurring fashion, patreon.com/sciencesortof is a way to do that, where you can sign up for various levels. Tom signed up at a level that got him a thesis. And hopefully, Tom, you enjoyed your thesis. And we got a few more theses coming up, but we're actually, we're nearing the end of our theses list, Joe.
Oh, really?
Yes, we're getting close. So
wow.
There will be space available, I'll say, and to put a positive spin on it for the folks who would like a thesis. One of the things that we've mentioned before, and I'll mention it very briefly here again, is that if you sign up for a Patreon level, so the Avogadro's Army, which is like the second tier level, if you sign up for that for even a month and then drop it back down or even cancel your Patreon subscription, like, we're not going to be jerks. We're going to give you a thesis. Like, it's not about holding people's feet to the donation fire. It's about just like having a good time with our community and having fun with it. So even if you're not able to support a Patreon level indefinitely, any level of support for any level of time will get you the rewards. I think the only one we have a capper on is the highest one, just because it means printing costs. So if you're curious what that means, you can go check it out at patreon.com/sciencesortof. Thanks for joining me, Joe.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me on. It was fun.
Yeah.
As usual.
I wanted you on because I'd been saving this Rock and Rye can for you, but I also was just excited to talk to you as a friend. We'd been trying to schedule this for a minute, and I was getting sad that we weren't chatting. But now we did.
I know.
We did it.
We did it. Yeah, we did it. We did it. We did it. Hooray.
All right, Joe. I think also this is the first time in the history of the show, since you and I discussed this idea in the first place, which is another good reason to have you on, where when I say the thing that ends the show, I can't say it because I don't want to trigger it.
Right.
When I say the thing that ends the show, you're going to be joined by our guest, Jesse.
Oh, yeah? We're going to do the thing?
Oh, we're doing the thing.
Oh, man.
So, Joe, you and Jesse, and all the listeners, when you come back next time, I can promise you're going to get a whole lot more science.
Sort of.
Visit sciencesortof.com for show notes, links to all the stories we talked about, and ways to interact with the hosts, guests, and other listeners. Science Sort of is brought to you by the Brachiolobe Media Network of podcasts, with audio engineering by Tim Dobbs of the Encyclopedia Brunch podcast. That's all for this week. See you next time on Science Sort of.
It's fake news.
No, I couldn't tell if you were being serious or not, or playing along, but did you maybe say the actual last? Well, I guess
I was trying to play it along.
I know. I just read it wrong and I broke the bit, and we're just gonna cut the whole
Ruined it.
I know. Sorry.
Ugh.